What if history's greatest transformations almost never began with crowds? When we look back across history, it's easy to imagine that civilizations changed all at once. An empire falls, a law is passed, a movement succeeds, a revolution begins. Looking backward, those moments seem almost inevitable. But history rarely feels that way while people are living through it. Long before anyone notices a great movement, someone quietly begins carrying an idea. A conversation happens around a kitchen table. A teacher encourages a single student. A handful of friends begin imagining a different future. A small community chooses to keep living differently, even when almost no one else understands why. At first, almost nothing appears to change. Then something remarkable begins to happen. Ideas move through relationships. Courage becomes contagious. Communities slowly grow. And one day, history gives a name to something that had been quietly unfolding for years. Perhaps that's why so many of history's greatest transformations seem to begin in remarkably ordinary places. Not because small groups possess extraordinary power, but because relationships have always been one of the ways that change quietly travels through the world. Today, I'd like to walk you through a few moments from history and ask a different question. Not how do civilizations change, but why do history's greatest transformations so often begin long before history notices them? You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. History has a remarkable habit of making great movements look a lot larger than they were at the beginning. Looking backward, we often see institutions, nations, and generations transformed. Looking closer, we usually find something much smaller. The earliest Christian communities didn't begin as an empire or a global religion. They began as small groups of ordinary people who believed that the way that they lived together mattered. Long before churches filled cities, conversations unfolded around tables, in homes, and along dusty roads. What eventually shaped civilizations first existed within relationships. Centuries later, the abolition movement also began long before laws changed. Small circles of people gathered to write, to organize, to persuade, and to imagine a society that many believed was impossible. Decades of quiet work passed before history recorded the larger victories that followed. Even then, the work was not finished. Nearly a century later, Rosa Parks quietly refused to surrender her seat on a Montgomery bus. Her courage mattered, but so did the community that surrounded her. Neighbors organized, churches gathered, families walked together. What became one of the defining movements of the 20th century did not grow out of one remarkable individual alone. It grew because many ordinary people chose to carry the same hope together. Different centuries, different communities, different kinds of change. And yet, they all seem to preserve another remarkably familiar movement. History's greatest transformations rarely begin with massive crowds. They begin with small circles of people who quietly refuse to stop carrying what gives life. Perhaps that's the first pattern worth noticing. As I continued following this pattern, I found myself wondering why history seemed to return to small groups so often. Why not begin with crowds? Why do so many lasting movements seem to grow through relationships instead? Perhaps the answer is simpler than it first appears. Human beings don't simply exchange information, we learn by watching one another. Parents shape children long before they can fully explain why. Teachers influence students not only through lessons, but through quiet example of their own lives. Friends slowly shape one another through countless ordinary conversations that no history book will ever record. Anthropologists have long observed that culture survives because communities embody it together. Developmental psychologists have shown that trust, belonging, and secure relationships create the conditions in which people are most able to learn and grow. Education reminds us that information may fill a page, but wisdom is often formed through practice, encouragement, correction, and shared experience. Perhaps that's why history so often begins with small circles. Relationships make trust possible. Trust makes learning possible. Learning makes courage possible. And courage, once lived, has a remarkable way of inviting courage in someone else. Different disciplines, different methods, different vocabularies. And yet they all seem to preserve another remarkably familiar observation. The deepest forms of change rarely spread through institutions. They spread through relationships. Perhaps that's the second pattern worth noticing. As I continued following these stories, another pattern slowly began to emerge. History has a curious habit of remembering breakthroughs while quietly forgetting everything that came before them. We remember the moment something changed. We rarely remember the years when it appeared that nothing was happening at all. Consider a bamboo forest. For years, most of its growth takes place beneath the surface. Roots quietly spread out through the soil, building a network strong enough to support what will eventually rise above the ground. To someone watching from the outside, it may seem as though nothing is happening. Then, seemingly all at once, the bamboo begins growing with remarkable speed. The sudden growth wasn't sudden at all. It was simply the visible expression of years of invisible preparation. History often moves in remarkably similar ways. Long before the printing press transformed Europe, generations of scribes patiently copied manuscripts by hand. They preserved knowledge through centuries when books were rare and learning traveled slowly. When printing finally accelerated the spread of ideas, history naturally remembered the revolution. It remembered less often the countless faithful hands that quietly carried knowledge until the moment the world was ready to receive it differently. Even scientific discoveries often follow a similar pattern. An idea is proposed, it meets resistance, evidence slowly accumulates, years or sometimes decades pass before what once seemed impossible gradually becomes accepted. Looking backward, the change appears obvious. Living through it rarely feels that way. Different stories, different centuries, different kinds of transformation, and yet they all seem to preserve another remarkably familiar movement. The most important work often becomes visible only after years of quiet faithfulness. Perhaps that's why history's greatest transformations usually begin long before history notices them. Perhaps that's the third pattern worth noticing. As these patterns continued gathering together, I found myself noticing one final surprise. History often teaches us how fear spreads. A rumor becomes accepted as fact. Suspicion slowly becomes division. Division becomes hostility. Hostility becomes violence. We've explored those movements before. But history preserves another pattern just as consistently. Hope spreads too. One act of courage quietly gives someone else permission to be courageous. One teacher believes in a struggling student who later becomes the teacher someone else needed. One family chooses forgiveness instead of bitterness, changing relationships that may continue for generations. One community decides to welcome the stranger instead of fearing them, and trust slowly begins growing where suspicion once lived. The movements are almost invisible at first. Kindness invites kindness. Curiosity invites curiosity. Generosity invites generosity. Hope, once embodied, has a remarkable way of becoming easier for someone else to imagine. Different cultures, different generations, different stories, and yet they all seem to preserve another remarkably familiar movement. Whatever human beings consistently practice together has a remarkable way of spreading through relationships. Perhaps that's why history remembers great movements. Long before they became movements, they were simply ordinary people quietly becoming the kind of people others could learn from. Perhaps that's the fourth pattern worth noticing. Perhaps that's why these stories have stayed with me. Not because they convinced me that history always bends towards what gives life, and certainly not because every small beginning eventually changes the world. History is far too honest for that. Instead, they invited me to ask a different question. Not, how do I change civilization? But something much quieter. What has been entrusted to me? Because history suggests that the greatest transformations rarely begin with extraordinary people. More often, they begin with ordinary people who choose, day after day, to faithfully carry something that gives life. A parent raising a child, a teacher encouraging a student, a neighbor showing kindness, a friend choosing forgiveness, a community quietly caring for one another. None of these moments appear large enough to change history, and yet history repeatedly suggests that this is often exactly where change begins. Perhaps that's because the future is rarely built all at once. It's built conversation by conversation, relationship by relationship, generation by generation. Which makes me wonder, what kind of hope am I carrying? What habits am I quietly helping to spread? What relationships have already been entrusted to my care? And perhaps most importantly, am I becoming the kind of person others can learn from? No one else can answer those questions for us. Every generation answers them again. Perhaps that's why history's greatest transformations usually begin long before history notices them. Not because extraordinary people suddenly appear, but because ordinary people quietly chose together to carry what gives life. And perhaps without always realizing it, we become one of those small clusters too. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Come back next week when we talk about stepping back and becoming the observer. I'll see you there.